Sorry, just as our first panel this morning gets organised, I just thought I'd maybe just provide one or two introductory comments, if I may. So, as Gail said, this session is really all about pace and scale in nature markets. And I think we can all reflect, or I certainly have already this morning, on some of the key messages from our Cabinet Secretary for Finance. So no country yet really has set out a full strategic approach to developing a market for natural capital. And we heard yesterday, and I suspect we'll hear again, that this isn't easy, but things that are worth doing seldom are. And again, just to reiterate, I suppose locally here in Scotland, we are certainly ready and willing to embrace this challenge precisely because it is urgent and because it is essential, and it is also quite exciting. So, the Financing UK Nature Recovery Initiative, what and who is it? So, the initiative that we're just about to hear from brings together a coalition of organisations that recognise current spending is not sufficient to reverse the declines of nature in the UK. And it's a collaboration that originated with a proposal from the Broadway Initiative, Green Finance Institute and Finance Earth in November 2020. And the aim is to create those investable markets, those elusive investable markets and projects for mainstreaming to mobilise the capital towards nature-based solutions. So what's not to like about that? I won't say much by way of milestones, but so far in November 2020, we saw a proposal for financing UK nature recovery. In September of this year, a strategic directions paper, and in October, a draft recommendation and roadmap. So I'm sure we will hear a little bit more about that this morning. So looking forward to a stimulating and challenging panel discussion to hopefully shine a light on what we all need to do to establish those value-led, high-integrity markets. Before introducing the panel, I'll pass over to Ed Lockhart from the Broadway Initiative just to further set the scene.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Robbie. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. As Robbie said, I convene the Broadway Initiative, which is an alliance of the main business organisations working on climate and environment, and nature investments particularly become a priority for us because it's so important to our community. As Robbie said, we've been pulling together this work with Green Finance Institute, Finance Earth, and a coalition including the likes of CLA and many other organisations, and been delighted to work with the Scottish Government, Treasury, DEFRA, the Welsh Government and others to start to put together this framework. I've been really excited by the last 2 days because I think collectively we're at a new frontier. I think what we're doing actually is putting together, creating a new architecture for nature investment. And with that, I think brings a huge challenge and responsibility to make sure that what collectively we're doing is coherent, because I think it has huge ramifications for how we approach nature in the future. So I think that's things like, how do we join up the great work we heard on TNFD yesterday with the framework and roadmap we're collectively producing in this coalition, and make sure that what we're doing is coherent internationally, coherent across the UK. So I think, as we're creating, we've really got to think about how collectively we're joined up. So my hope is that as a group we can work together, particularly over the next year, because there's pace and scale, but there's particular need, I think, for pace and to bring that architecture together very quickly. So Scotland is a natural convener for this. I think clear natural advantages in nature, in investment, in innovation. So my suggestion would be, perhaps we come here for another 2 days some point next year and really try and join up these pieces so that what we have is something we can show to the world as a really clear, coherent architecture. So on that, I should have given David time. I think David was going to just present the framework. I don't know if Ruchir if he's able to do that. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to my colleague David.
Thanks, Ed. For those of you who haven't been involved in the initiative, we just thought we'd give you a bit of an overview to tune you in for the panel discussion. So it has certainly been very encouraging that at the halfway mark of COP, we can see the fundamental interconnection between net zero and nature recovery coming to the fore. But we need to take decisive action, and that was the origins of the Financing UK Nature Recovery Initiative. Recognition that the scale of the challenge was vastly greater than the funding available from government and philanthropic sources. Earlier this year, in his seminal work on the economics of biodiversity, Professor Dasgupta set out clearly the reasons for this underinvestment. Deep-rooted and widespread institutional failure, which is why, as Ed has just said, we need a new architecture. In the government's response to Dasgupta, we were invited to set forward a roadmap for scaling up high integrity environmental markets. And the critical word we see here is high integrity. The need for certainty, the need for investment certainty, for public confidence, trust in these markets. And I think it'd be fair to say it's been a bit of a checkered path to date. We have done an awful lot of work on barriers to action, and I was really pleased to hear that earlier today people were talking about let's crack on, let's overcome these barriers. We don't need to talk anymore about the barriers. They are clear, they're understood. What we now need is action. In addition to the scale of the challenge and the limitations of public finance, the risks basically currently exceed potential returns, as we have heard, partly because benefits of nature are not properly valued, but also because of the economics of land use and delivery and regulatory silos. And we shouldn't underestimate the distrust of markets and private finance. After all, it's been market forces that has driven the decline of nature across the globe. So when we were asked to produce a roadmap, the first question is, what's the destination? And we've set out a vision that high integrity markets for nature-based environmental services will become a major driver of nature recovery across the UK. Importantly, markets are very good at establishing prices, rewarding integration, lowering transaction costs, finding the projects to match different types of capital with their risk-reward appetite, stimulating innovation and delivering better value for public money. But in addition to having a really clear understanding of the barriers, we also have the benefit of international experience. There are environmental markets across the world that have shown, both through their successes and failures, what can be achieved, ranging from the air quality markets first established in the United States, through to our own renewables obligation, which provided a clear framework for private investment and a clear target for action, to more recent initiatives, such as in Australia, where the Reef Credit Scheme is protecting the Great Barrier Reef through public and private funding together. And of course, our landmark Woodland Carbon Code, which is the gold standard of codes at this point. But also to learn from things like energy efficiency markets, which have quite a lot of similarities, in fact, to nature, being dispersed, needing to aggregate, potentially high transaction costs. Anyway, we've looked at all of these and concluded that the core features of well-designed markets come down to three things: clear and coherent, as Ed said, market design, a robust market governance, and a clear mechanism for market operation. We've set that out in our investment framework, and you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through the detail. You can read about it online. And we published that framework in our strategic directions, and encouraged by some real leadership from Scotland, who took the initiative to do some initial workshops with us in early September. We then broadened that out across the UK and got feedback on that framework. And so we're now in the stage of recommendations. We are looking at how do we have a fair distribution of the obligation for nature recovery, a driver for investment. We need to review the existing policies that are getting in the way of that investment. And we particularly need to look at how we integrate outcomes. We cannot operate on the basis of a carbon market here, a nutrient market here, a biodiversity market here, without any coherent join up between them, because nature is fundamentally integrated. We also need to get the governance in place. This is tricky. We need organisations who actually provide the authority for these markets. In the case of the renewables obligation, of course, it was Ofgem. Who is going to play that role to provide the authority for credits from nature. We need published standards. It's great that there's work going on, but it's not with a coherent set of standards and a framework to guide it. And accreditation and joining up with things like the UK framework that's being developed under the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And we've heard a lot today, of course, about decision grade data. Last but not least is the recommendations for operation, the project pipeline, supporting projects through patient capital, but fundamentally empowering communities to build the capacity and develop the projects so that they can benefit from these investments. We need the market infrastructure, platforms, contracts, and above all, perhaps, we need leadership. Our next steps is to put, our full set of draft recommendations are on our website. Our next steps are to have a draft report by the end of November, final report by the end of the year, and of course, cracking on with it in 2022.
Thank you, David. That's a wonderful run through as always. Thank you. And hopefully provides a lot of food for thought for our panel. As you can see, we have a full panel here. We've got about 45 minutes, I think. Let me know if we can go over it all. So we're going to get through a lot and hopefully leave a lot of time for your own questions and answers at the end. But I just want to introduce you to our panel, who are doing some incredible work, each from different angles around driving private finance into nature. And I hope Eva's joined us. Yes. So I'll start with Eva over here. It's lovely to join. Thanks for joining us, Eva. Eva Mayerhofer is Senior Environment and Biodiversity Specialist with the EIB. Just checking she can see us. Great.
Yes, thank you.
We have Ruchir Shah, Director External Affairs at the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Archie Ruggles-Brise, who is representing all landowners today, and a strong and healthy interest in beavers, which we will get to. And then we have Adam Purvis as the Scottish lead for Dark Matter Labs, Jamie Mansfield, co-founder and managing director of Finance Earth, and James Cameron, senior advisor at Pollination Foundation. So plenty of expertise here and an interesting conversation, I'm sure. So I thought where we'd start is really just reflections on what David has just shared. So I'd love to sort of go one by one and just hear which element to you from the presentation of the recommendation really stands out as being the most important in our drive to create high integrity environmental markets. So I'll start down this end. So please, James.
Do I need amplification, or are you fine? Okay. So first of all, thanks very much for bringing us all together in this rather wonderful place. David's representation of that very good report probably needs an extra endorsement. I just really do encourage people to read that report. A lot of work has gone into it, lots of consultation, lots of different points of view, and it's just a very important thing to look at. Now, it'll go through other stages, of course, but do please get into it and contribute your own views. The one piece I would like to focus on is actually how to bring all the parts together in an institutional design that is recognizable, so it doesn't feel like it's too far off what is familiar, that can be trusted by a quite skeptical private sector finance community that is attracted to scale but nervous about complexity, and at the same time can be presented credibly to those who are really concerned about place, about the specificity of that particular landscape or ecosystem, or where very precisely the money would have to go in order to deliver the public good associated with the restoration of that land, not some other piece of land. So we know we've got a tension. We always have had a tension between scale, integrity, and the delivery of something particular in a particular place. Mm-hmm. Right? We understand that. We have to overcome it. And that does require building institutions that have that capacity to offer something to a marketplace that needs simplicity and the replicability of an instrument, as well as satisfying somebody that the work that's being done is appropriate for that place. And in the middle, of course, lots of other interests associated with the management of land, the agricultural community, where, again, there's an understandable lack of trust and a certain fear of the change that's coming. So that's all about institution building. And it's often undervalued. It's considered to be boring or that somebody else's responsibility, but actually it's not. It's the responsibility here, very obviously, is all of the market participants, all of the people who are interested in the outcome have got to contribute to what is going to work. And unfortunately, perhaps David was too polite to emphasise this, there's no obvious candidate today. I might suggest, not just because we're here, that it might be a bit more obvious in Scotland than it is down south. But nonetheless, you really do need to be creative here. It's not obvious that there's an existing institution that's competent and ready to take on the burden of all of those elements, to participate in design, to figure out operability, and to work with the marketplace with new participants, including some very big financial institutions who are ready to put money in, but they've got lots of reasons not to. Maybe I'll leave it there and then others to go. But
Yeah,
that's
so many questions from that, including, do we need a new task force? Is there another task force in our future?
I'm a bit sceptical about task force formation, but I do think that there is a major effort of pulling parts together. There's always a need for some kind of goodwill broker, intermediary, always. But we're starting from a situation where, just to be brutally honest, the main governmental institution is itself very, shall we say, fractured. Doesn't always communicate adequately between parts of DEFRA. We've got to have Treasury involved. Because we've talked about it a lot, I'd like to see the new infrastructure bank given a natural capital mandate, because, by the way, they could be a very, very handy partner in all of this. Public goods mandate already, capacity to bring in private capital, should be building expertise and real skill in the deployment of capital into natural capital. They should build that capacity. We should be really good at that. Here's an institution that's being formed. Let's make sure it does it.
Okay, brilliant. Jamie, what's your thoughts?
Thank you, Helen, and it's a real privilege to be here today. And I just want to give a few sort of background points as to why Finance Earth worked with yourselves, Green Finance Institute, and the Broadway Initiative on this process to build this coalition, and some of the key takeaways that I think are really important from what have come out in the report. So Finance Earth exists in a very privileged position. We live between the world of finance and conservation, helping to really build those models that actually bring finance into the real world and actually create these structures on the ground. And what we were increasingly seeing is that actually the solutions that were needed were not just solvable at a project level. You couldn't do that even at a sort of county level, and this is both within the UK and internationally. And increasingly what we've seen, and exactly why we teamed up with yourselves, was that it really requires this golden thread between the project up into the political realm and to the legal legislative structures that sit around that, to ensure that not only the revenue streams can be created, but the quality of the outcomes can be maintained, and that the wider communities and the local regions can actually benefit fairly from those activities. So the sort of, I guess, the three things that I think are really important that come through the report. The first one is ambition. There is so much time pressure on us all to act, and there are some really important, ambitious things that this proposal is working through. So the idea that we could create a positive nature obligation on specific sectors to actually incentivize, learning from the growth of the renewable energy market, taking the tools that led to the success of that in the UK, taking those mechanisms and applying those to the natural environment, I think is a really, really powerful opportunity and could be scaled very quickly. Linked to that is about ensuring quality. And as we start to race towards scale, and particularly with the speed of scale of operation, ensuring we can do that and not erode quality of outcomes and erode benefit of outcomes is really, really fundamental. And so the work that's gone into understanding the standards, the metrics, ensuring that we codify what quality really means is also absolutely fundamental to this market working and sustainably working. And then thirdly, and I guess from my own career, originally starting in engineering, thirdly, this is practical. And exactly as James is saying, this is about the actual institutional design, the actual specific things that need to be created, and the tools that we see, things like with DEFRA creating the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. It'd be fantastic to see the equivalent in Scotland, but creating those practical tools that can help build the sector and actually move this out of the world of conversation and theory, but into real practical actions.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm writing a list here and we'll come back and dive into these in more detail because I think it's worth unpicking them. Adam.
So I'll be quick. So I'd like to challenge the idea that we don't have the institutions already. I think that we have the institutions. There is something around the capacity building of those institutions to fulfil that role. I also think that there is the way that Scotland operates, there is a very solid network of organisations that operate in this space. And their proximity to each other, largely led by, initiated by Ruchir and with the Pioneers group, is actually highly functional. It's a highly functional group, and it represents all of the organisations in this space. So for me, there is something about the network of institutions that are able to do this work. And if you look at the work that we need to do around, outlined in the report, from regulation to the data work, to the accounting work that needs to happen, to the innovative financing mechanisms that need to get built, that will require a network of organisations that are building things in view of each other. So take, for example, an investment readiness fund, and I know there are proposals for one of those on the table at the moment. There's no point us just producing an investment readiness fund that isn't testing the regulatory infrastructure and the data infrastructure and the accounting infrastructure with every investment that it makes. Because ultimately, the games that we're going to play over the next 2 years will be about testing infrastructure so that it can grow. I have faith in the existing organisations in Scotland to play here in Scotland to play the roles that they need to. What they need is trust. What they need is trust from above, but ultimately as well, I think government needs to learn to trust itself internally as well. The Scottish Government has that problem. There are some exceptional people in the Scottish Government, and giving them licence to lean into this now, licence and budget to lean into this now, knowing that over the next 24 months we're going to make some big mistakes, but we need to be given that permission and that wriggle room, and we need to trust each other and trust our existing institutions and invest in the capacity building of those institutions, I think, rather than bringing another one to the table. That would be my twopence worth.
Yeah. Okay, we'll keep on going in this direction and then we can come back round for reflections on your comments, Adam. Archie.
Yes, thank you. I also feel very privileged to be here. I'm a proper beaver out of water in this setting here, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm not as comfortable with some of the terminology that you'll sort of talk about all the time. But coming at this from a kind of practical land management perspective, looking at the report, which I recognised a lot of the challenges that I'm trying to deal with in trying to build a sustainable land use model, introduce new systems of farming, introduce new systems of reprioritising our land use model around the delivery of environmental and public goods. And at the moment, what we're struggling with is that there isn't the revenue case there at a micro level. And you're all talking about scale, but scale is relative. I'm a relatively large landowner in East Anglia, but in terms of scale, I'm a dot on a rounding error on one of your spreadsheets. So we really need to understand that. It's big stuff for me. There is a level of risk. There is a level of confidence building that needs to be done in the sector. And this will come from clarity. It will also come from, I think, focusing more on outcomes rather than actions. And we're very much, as the land management world, been kind of used to being told what to do and not really having to worry about what happens because of what we've done. And I think that's something that this report really brings out quite nicely. But also, allied to that, is this ability to fail. Because what we're doing here, we don't know what the land use models are that will deliver the best quality of environmental goods. So if we go at this and say, well, there are only certain models that we can deploy that we think we've got enough confidence in to deliver the outcomes, what I would say is, no, chuck that idea out, focus on the outcomes, build your monitoring framework, build the data points, work with people who can collect the information in a cost-effective way, pull it all together, and then work out which of those models over land uses are actually doing the best. So it's a kind of flip it on its head approach, and that requires a degree of confidence from the finance sector and the public sector that is, I think, unusual to find, particularly down at the kind of debt financing, land management, individual business level where I operate at.
Thanks, Archie. Maybe this will come back to sort of the use of public sector to sort of be that capital at risk. Ruchir.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of blood, sweat and tears and a lot of David's heart and soul has gone into this report that David has introduced here and the work that he's doing around financing UK nature. And I've been privileged to be part of the core group, working alongside Helen and others to contribute to that. And I've seen how that initiative itself has been very clear in trying to engage not just across sectors with environmental NGOs as well as the finance community and with but also across the different nations of the UK as well, which I think is really important. And that cross-learning across nations has been baked into the core of the work that David has been leading on through Broadway. I would say that for me, at the Scottish Wildlife Trust, we hosted the World Forum on Natural Capital for 2 years, a few years ago. And it's been very keen for us that this is ultimately about people and relationships, more so perhaps than even than the money and the structures. So getting the people and the relationships in place, warming things up in Scotland has been really quite key for us. I think with that in place and with the opportunities provided by what the Cabinet Secretary yesterday in her speech mentioned, which was government stepping up and playing their role, as well as supporting the finance sector to engage collaboratively with environmental NGOs and others, and those that are directly owning land and working directly with the communities that will be directly affected and will need to have their own ownership and sense of buy-in into these solutions is quite critical for us. So the Scottish Wildlife Trust is ultimately a solutions-focused organisation. So as the clamour develops over COP26, as more interest comes in the wake of that, I think we need to move pretty quickly and crack on, as somebody in the chat just said just now. But having people and those relationships between people in place is really key to cracking on.
Brilliant, thank you. And Eva, thanks for waiting patiently over there. So I wonder if we can come to you now and just get your reflections, particularly from having an international perspective as well.
Thank you, Helen. It's a difficult task to follow from the other panelists, and I read the report actually with great interest because I think it applies to and it's very useful for all of us trying to invest in the sector. I mean, markets for us do not adequately value nature, and they haven't. I mean, to date, let's say there are a couple of front runners, market players, and they've been dominating the market, but the market as a whole hasn't been valuing nature. And I think this is very clear. And it is still much more economical to destroy a forest than turn it into, let's say, if we are looking at the international context, a palm oil plantation, than it is actually to protect that forest. So we have to fundamentally shift that thinking, and we can only do that, I believe, through regulation, moratoriums, and through the right incentives to drive that change. And I think the report discusses some of these drivers for change. But we also need those capital markets to be pricing nature and, in fact, making the case that protecting nature is more economic than destroying it. And this we have found at the EIB to be very difficult and has been one of the greatest barriers to investing in nature-positive business solutions because of the insufficient pricing of negative externalities of biodiversity and ecosystem loss. Not only on our side as a financial institution, I don't think we do that well enough, but also by businesses themselves. So Because policymakers and investors haven't been able to properly value nature, what we've seen is that the finance industry has been using the carbon market as a proxy for investing in it. But carbon as a pollutant and not the fundamental building block of life, which is carbon in its solid form. So governments need to start taking account of ecosystem benefits of nature beyond carbon capture. And this is what we would be advocating. And we are only now just beginning to correct this market failure and bringing actually the powers of the market to essentially reverse the damage that we have done for a very long time and to unlock this financing of nature-based solutions. And I think this report has been extremely critical and valuable in trying to address some of these barriers and turn and make that shift and providing basically some of the solutions to address some of these barriers. And it's only by harnessing that power of markets can we start protecting our environment and preventing its rapid destruction. But I'd like to come to one point that I think all panelists made, which is that people are at the center of this discussion. And without engaging with the landowners, and to date, this is something that has been really missing, without engaging with the landowners, with communities, we will not be able to scale up nature-based investments.
Thank you, Eva. So actually, Archie, I'm going to come to you in a second because I think I'd love to hear from you the challenge of looking beyond carbon as you're thinking to ecosystem services. But James, I know you have some strong feelings about carbon can't be all that we have, so I thought...
Absolutely. In fact, Eva put it very well, and my colleagues and I at the Pollination Foundation have been doing this project into parallel with you guys, with GFI and with Broadway, and had a lot of conversations over the past 18 months or so with people who have a strong interest in the outcomes. And it's very clear that whilst we can use carbon as a proxy, where there is a marketplace, albeit one that's somewhat fractured with very variable prices, it's obviously insufficient as a marker of value for investment in natural systems. So we're going into this space now where we don't want to confuse and put off an interested capital marketplace in carbon. We want to draw them in on terms. We've got to explain very clearly, and you know because you've heard me say it so many times, it's a public goods marketplace. It's only there to deliver an outcome that's a public good outcome. So if you want to play, you've got to play on those terms. You've also got to understand it's got length to it. So your contracts create the asset. There's nothing else. The contract is the asset. The asset has length. The removals, if they're going to be removals, have to over a very long period of time. That's where the value, the natural capital value, is created. So that contract's got to last. Even if you trade it 100 times, the contract itself's got to last. You might want to think about a guarantee that sits behind it. It could be a government guarantee. It could be half government, half insurance. It's got to be something that we can have confidence that over time will deliver real reductions, real removals. Secondly, it's perfectly possible, we do it all the time, to have composite values. The oil market, for goodness sake, has many prices, and it's pretty commoditized. So we can construct instruments captured in a contract that have layers of value. We can also have separate instruments that we stack up, we know that, although sometimes that complexity is off-putting to certain investors. They might have to get over it, but that is certainly the case. And we want quality to be most valued. So again, we might have different prices for those things that deliver different values or multiple values. So this is all possible. It should not be seen as too complex or too difficult to deliver. But building up from, yes, carbon, but it's not enough. Yes, these other values need to be put into a contract that can be traded. We have to have length. And we've got to be able to communicate as clearly as possible the public goods mission in every single instrument. Otherwise, we'll attract the wrong kind of capital in the marketplace, and people will have misaligned expectations, and there'll be disappointments, and money will go in the wrong direction, and there'll be a reaction, as there has been in the past. Yeah.
And also investors won't come because they won't have the confidence that their reputation won't end up in
Exactly, and listen, most investors are followers, right? They're not leaders. They're waiting for someone else to show the way. The last thing they want is to go into a marketplace, A, look a fool, Don't like to look stupid. B, lose money. C, take away an opportunity that might be there in the future. So they'll hold back. They'll hold back until they think somebody that they trust has sent a signal that's clear enough and long enough that they can respond to. And that signal has got to be, we've got to be cleverer than just making it carbon. It has to be more than that.
So I'm just conscious of time and I really want to allow a lot of questions. So we've got, let's do another sort of 5 to 10 minutes. Archie, as a landowner, representing all landowners, sorry, I mean, how complex is it for you thinking about how you're going to sell some of these services?
It can be very complex, and it is a complete mindset change to the sort of standard food and fibre approach that the whole market and the whole land management sector is designed to serve. So everything from the advisory service to the legal service to the taxation services that sit underneath this are all pushing against a holistic multi-benefits type approach. And so what we did with it was trying to sort of unpick that slightly and say, okay, well, we're going to take a natural capital approach. We'll do the appraisal over the top. We'll try and model some of the ecosystem services that our land is capable of producing. And I completely recognise the variability of pricing because, you know, our land is going to be able to produce a certain amount of environmental goods or ecosystem services at any one particular point in time. But not only will that change if you move to a different land holding, it will also change over time. So the fact that I have either delivered or not delivered an ecosystem service means that the market then changes over time. So what I'm going to be doing in 10 years' time will be different to what I'm doing now. But the challenge really is getting the individual beneficiaries, because most of these contracts at the moment are being struck on a micro scale. So I am talking to individual water companies and our local authority and others to try and work out, okay, what is it that's going to motivate them to invest on a scale that they understand, but also then they can actually come and visit. Because that's a really important thing. That's where the trust, in the absence of a sort of institutional trust, the real trust comes from, I know that I can show you that piece of land, which is the bit that you bought for biodiversity net gain credits or whatever it might be. And I think that's the challenge. Whilst we've got a holistic plan that's sitting over the top of our land use, it is very complicated around, the type of land use system, an agroforestry system and a beaver-created wetland system and some woodland creation. And how do you kind of pull out all the multi-benefits of that? But then we have to take it apart again to put it into the really informal market. So I think there's a real challenge here to try and sort of tease out those two different ways of achieving trust.
Jamie, I see you nodding.
I mean, I totally agree with what James and Archie are saying, and I think actually what Archie really succinctly is showing that from a land manager, landowner's perspective, the decisions that are being put forward are impossible to answer, because actually the level of uncertainty both within the revenue streams, the commercial impact of that, the scientific alignment in terms of what does good look like at the end of that, they are huge questions. And so I think all of that shouts that we do need to have this joined up system very quickly, actually, and the sort of the lights are looking at governments to help create those frameworks. The point on carbon, and that this is not just about carbon, couldn't agree more. I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding of nature-based solutions, and the amount of investors that are approaching us at the moment entirely driven by carbon market approach, and yet actually when you look at the sort of wider societal benefits that these landscapes, these seascapes can deliver, it's far, far greater than the carbon benefit of themselves. So I'll leave it there. Good to get into Q&A, I guess.
Yeah, I want to just go through everyone again, and then we'll go for it. But Adam, briefly, is it easier in an urban setting? You've done a lot of work in urban settings of measuring co-benefits and finding buyers and buyers.
Yeah,
sorry.
is it easier? It's more topical, and therefore it's and we've been able to again operate where we're doing the full stack of work. And that enables us to test all the different bits of infrastructure to make sure that it can work. So that's why we're working with Google and Morgan Stanley to do that in Glasgow. But again, it's about aggregation to reach the scale that it's at. I just want to make a wee point on just the I think one of the things that's just really important about us valuing natural assets for all of the benefits that they produce, or many more of them, and being able to stack those benefits before they become tradable assets. It's ultimately about the resilience of the asset class. Yeah. That's what you're talking about, like servicing these assets and maintaining them over the time is the real problem. I'm not worried about the money. The money is there, ready and waiting. It's how we structure and organise how that money comes into this and plays a role. And the assurance will come to a system that can promise a greater level of resilience of those asset classes.
You also talk about the monitoring of them.
Yeah,
the management of the asset itself.
The maintenance of these assets is going to be the nut to crack.
Yeah, good point.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's where public sector financing could play a role through, I don't know, guarantees.
So good governance and
Okay.
actually showing what good governance looks like.
Well, trusts that have length to them, you know, I mean, really. I mean,
In cities, for us, it's ultimately about moving trees as costs on the balance sheet of the city to assets.
Yeah.
That's the job that we're trying to do. When you change them from costs to assets, the city has a fundamentally different relationship with them.
It's good language, that, because if you call them assets, then you can manage those assets. That's language that resonates, right? You've got to manage those assets, just as you do with renewable energy assets. And, they've got to be managed in order to deliver the performance. That's good. Got it.
Right, we'll quickly finish with Eva and then Ruchir and then open up for questions. Eva, I feel... Oh, I know, I need to stand over here, sorry. I'd be remiss not to ask you about the Natural Capital Finance Facility, and could you share with us some of the achievements that came out of that? And I hope we'll have a bit of a discussion on pipeline in a moment, but it would be great if you could sort of share with us how that worked and what that's achieved.
So in terms of achievement, I mean, we did manage to finance a decent pipeline of projects in the nature conservation and nature-based solutions space, but they were all very small and very niche. And what was very interesting, although it was supposed to target really the private sector, most of the projects were financed by public sector, and they were nature conservation components or nature-based solution components in larger infrastructure projects or in adaptation resilience plans of cities. And one of the issues that we faced, and I think Archie really described it from a landowner's perspective, but from a financier's perspective, is that natural capital comprises so many distinct assets which affect each other in very complex ways. And so for a financier also coming in and looking at the property rights over these different natural assets that have different costs, and the question then is, with whom do we have the contract with? Because these different natural capital assets affect each other and are interdependent on each other and rely on each other for the survival. That was one, addressing property holders of property rights was one complexity. And then I think what was addressed by the rest of the panel, it's long-term, who monitors, who manages then those assets is very, very difficult. And then dealing with our risk management colleagues within the institution was, I think, the biggest stumbling block, because trying to shift their mind to these types of projects and understanding that our traditional risk models that we use for infrastructure projects cannot be applied to those types of investments was the biggest challenge. So where we saw actually more success is in addressing the drivers of biodiversity and ecosystem loss rather than financing pure nature-based solutions.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Ruchir, any reflections that you wanted to add before we open it up to the audience?
Sure, yeah, I'll be very quick. Very less time. We've spoken quite a lot about how do we get, and put a lot of energies into how do we get the market to trust the assets, nature assets, to put the investment into it. But trust goes both ways. There's a growing awareness over the last few days, certainly, that we need to find a way in which, as the floodgates open, because they are going to open, as more and more investment comes into nature, how can people and communities trust the market and to be not greenwashing and when they're putting the investments in? And in order to do that, we're going to need to do three things. We're going to need to really big focus on accountability we're going to have a huge focus on transparency of the financial flows behind this. And I think we're going to have a very participative market so people can engage in it much more directly. I think with those three bits in place, we can build trust, but that is fragile. And there is always that danger of greenwashing lurking in the background.
Oh my God, there are just so many topics we could talk about all day. I'm so excited. But I'd love to open it up if anyone has any questions or just comments that you want to sort of throw in while we're having this sort of collaborative discussion. Peter.
Peter Young, various hats. I'm a co-founder of Broadway and also trustee of the Green Purposes Company, which is giving public accountability to a mission-driven bank. So has some resonance. I want to just raise a bit more about natural capital accounting. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that would be really helpful, because I'm really scared about the speed with which people are already intervening on our landscape to get carbon credits and doing so and actually destroying biodiversity while they're doing it. We need to move fast. We need to have a new metric. The one we have got is natural capital accounting. It's got some problems, but there is a British standard on it. It is something we could get done at a national level here in Scotland. We could ask local authorities to do it. We could apply at community level. We could show that every single intervention is something that has measure against natural capital criteria, which is the broader remit that we need to make sure we get it. I'm interested in what the panel think about how much potential there is from that.
Brilliant, thank you. And I can see there's quite a lot of questions, so we'll sort of try and get through as many as we can. Which of you would like to volunteer to reflect on Peter's comment? Anyone?
Happy to jump in.
Great,
I mean, totally agree with what Peter's saying. I think actually what we see across the whole landscape is that this sort of existence or acknowledgement of a baseline of what a condition looks like, and the view of what good quality looks like is actually a really important conversation. And then we need to build really clear standards around what those outcomes look like. And that needs to be aligned with the whole finance community, actually. And ultimately, I think that needs to be driven into regulation. And I think linking that with practical baseline data is going to be the only practical way to achieve that. And at the moment, we have a massive shortage of that level of granular information, and there isn't that many organisations that are actually trying to sort of stitch those gaps practically. And I think there's quite a major job to be done there. I think also when you look at data, it's also not just the sort of existence of data itself, it's also the interpretation of it. And we've got a whole supply chain of systems that need to be created actually around how you use that data and then interpret it to assess what the baseline and then what good quality starts to look like at the end of that.
Adam, I know you have some thoughts on data.
Well, it wasn't so much the data, sorry, I was just stuck at the beginning of the question, because I think it's a really interesting question, because that actually sits, the question you've got there actually sits within an area where Scotland has legislative powers. So I'd probably throw this at Victoria, but because she bangs her head up against this all the time. But out of the 4 different areas that we need to operate in, actually the area that you're talking about, we could move. We could move, and we could do something that shores up the system. So thanks for pointing that out. That's just my point. And I'm throwing that at Victoria.
Helen, if I might just, thank you. I completely understand the natural capital accounting is something we've sort of dipped our toe into, but it is still only a partial account. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to work with both our district council, our county council, and regional water resources agglomerations to try and understand how do you nest the framework. Because the framework needs to work for me, which will then tell you or anyone else, what it is that I'm doing on which piece of land, which is delivering what outcome, and then that needs to be aggregated up. The issue with natural capital accounting that's coming down from the kind of corporate sector is that it starts very big, and then it just loses resolution at a point that doesn't really help us give me decision-grade data. Because I need decision-grade operational data, which needs to be related to the natural capital condition of those assets. And so that's something to think about. There's been a lot of talk about the kind of top-down investment approach here, but I have to look at it from the bottom up, because there's no other way. I can't tell you what 10 kilometre squares of anything's going to look like, because that's far bigger than I'm able to influence. So I think we do need to be aware of that.
Helen, you want to try
Please.
Nuance to that, because that is a real danger that a gap opens up between what is measurable and relevant to the on-ground, as it were, decision, and what is measurable and relevant to the investment decision, and they don't match. Probably, I'm just sort of looking across to those who are in government, or there's probably one or two intervention points that will deal with that.
Yeah.
I'm open-minded about where that is. You know, it could be at the private contract level. It probably will need to be some kind of regulatory framework associated with, possibly with accounting itself. Right? There's going to be an intervention point that allows us to close that gap. It might be because there is a kind of standard that becomes either quasi-regulatory or an expectation in order to be able to acquire some other benefit. It might be because of its access to finance something, or it might be access to insurance. There will be one or two intervention points that will try their damnedest to close that gap, because I do think that's a worry.
Thank you. Oh, we'll take one more from the room, then we'll come to online. Is that okay? Would you like, if you could shout your name for those online.
Okay, thank you. I'm Gordon Watson, Chief Executive of the National Park here, so delighted to have you. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of this session, so you may have covered this, but I'm interested in the panel's views on the regulatory environment. As a park authority, we're a planning authority, and having to think about how our planning policies respond to this. There's a debate about deer management and how much that should move away from voluntary if we're going to protect assets from that. There's a debate about grouse moors and muir burn, and there's all these issues that we need to think about alongside the investment side, and I'm just interested in any views on that regulatory side of things.
Great.
Thanks.
Any Ruchir, please.
Yeah, I think for the that there is a need for a lot of development of the regulatory framework around this, but in order to inform that, we need to have a strategic wrapper around that. And the strategic wrapper that we need is the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy as part of the government's work on this. Now, we understand that the refresh of that is going to take place within 9 months of COP15, but the need really is much sooner than that. So we need to move a lot faster on some of this. Speed to match the scale of the speed at which the markets are going to be developing is going to be quite important. So that would be my plea. In order to support that, of course, behind that, we need to have policy coherence within government overall as well. That will then help the regulation of this to have the teeth it needs and the credibility it needs as well.
Thank you. Yeah, would love to go to some of the online questions if you have one, Hannah.
Great, yeah. The voice of Zoom in the room would like to bring up some questions and reflections around risk. So, of course, some of these projects are going to start, some of them will be successful, some of them will fail. And then simultaneously, if you're thinking about these projects as assets, can the insurance market be more invited to the table? Because, of course, these projects happening means that their risks go down. So an interesting debate online, but reflections on that would be appreciated from the onliners.
Risk.
I think it's incredibly appropriate given the conversation before was about regulation as well. So I'll go my quick sort of 2 pence on that. So I think the point around risk and learning and recognising we will have failures is really important to sort of to build into the system, and that we don't sort of create the framework that says we have to build at scale, we have to do at scale immediately, because actually that risk clearly starts to sort of accelerate both in its severity but also to the wider market confidence. And so having the support systems, a bit like the Investment Readiness Fund type programs that can help trial and test at an appropriate scale, but then you also need to make sure that those pilots absolutely have this, again, golden thread back to the regulation systems, so we can actually learn and improve with actually what's happening on the ground in the real world, and all the real questions that get asked when you're actually trying to fit this together in the practical environment. Quickly on the insurance point, the reinsurance market has an enormous role to play in this. It's the hidden buyer of a lot of these services, particularly when you look at risk benefit, flood reduction, and all the other climate adaptation benefits. And so they are, I would say, a really natural bedfellow for this whole market, which at the moment I think have stayed quite far away from the room, and I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity at the moment.
We really, really need to bring them into the room.
I know, why are they keeping their heads down?
Well,
What's going on?
because they make their money by putting premiums up. I mean, it's just really crude.
Yeah.
So, funny enough, I've got 1 or 2 meetings this week with people in the insurance industry who I really want to test out some products in their marketplace, particularly get the brokers involved because they know the marketplace. So you do need the reinsurance because they are backstop.
Absolutely.
As the government is, right? Who are the 2 big insurers of risk in this area? Government, taxpayer, and the reinsurance industry. Of course they've got to be in the conversation, but I'd like to get the brokers in to test them, to come up with some products that are going to be useful at dealing with this kind of risk. Obviously there's risk in inertia too, right? There's risk in waiting until it's absolutely perfect. That's no good. So we've got to use the risk transfer capital that's in their market to help us start, but recognise that there are going to be screw-ups. I mean, they just are. So that makes it an insurable risk. So let's get some creativity out of them, how they're going to deal with that. It's also the case that there are parallel risks that they're quite familiar with, including infrastructure risks and, you know, loss and damage associated with floods, etc., etc. That's close enough for them, I think, to step across and see the parallel. Resilience is actually the best word for that. And, you know, there was a resilience initiative here at COP, and we need really to push on here because this connection has got to be made in order to build the kind of marketplace that's robust enough to cope with the kind of capital that wants to come into it.
2.5 degrees warming, it's economic Armageddon.
Yes.
And all of these insurance companies' books are dead.
They're dead.
So they know that. So their motivations, we don't need to worry about them coming. They just need the pathways and mechanisms. And they need to be able to trust.
So I'm conscious of time, and we're going to, I think it's a half-hour break. So hopefully that gives people in the room a chance to ask more questions from the panel. But I did want to just end on a quick 15-second elevator pitch, I think, from each of you suggested. So Eva, I'm going to come to you first. Here we go. So if you had,
I think it's all been said, and I think I want to come back to something that was said in the previous session. We need to get on with it and or crack on with it because we have so many reports and case studies and so forth, and they're great and they're fantastic reading, but we need to start implementing and operationalizing some of those recommendations.
I couldn't agree more, and I see David nodding, even about the recommendations he's just talked through. David, anything you wanted to add as before we do a quick wrap up?
No, I thought it was a fantastic conversation, and I really like the focus on all of the interconnections, both people, institutions, risk, trust, and that's the essence of what the framework is trying to achieve. So I was listening intently. It was brilliant.
Right, so as we're going to crack on with our break, there's a quick final question for you. If you had 15 seconds in a lift, this is courtesy of Ed, with the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Economy and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, what would you say to them that we need for nature markets?
Two messages. Yeah. Do we stop the lift? You're not getting out.
Oh, shit.
So 15 seconds. What are you going to say, James?
Well, I want Rishi to give the infrastructure bank a natural capital mandate, and I think things here are moving quite nicely. I'd like the Scottish government to show off the first few natural capital investments. Make sure they're good ones, but the first few ones to say, look here, we mean it, this is happening, this is the money. So I'd like to do that, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Jamie.
I'm imagining this is a glass elevator, and I guess I would say, look at all this amazing wealth that Scotland and England have created out of the dead natural assets of the North Sea, and then look at all this amazing living natural assets that you could also create the next round of wealth through.
Yeah, I think it's about how we treat each other and the level of trust that those people have between themselves and also ultimately the way that they treat their own organisations. And I think there is about this kind of democratisation and devolution of more power to the people that work in your organisations and empowering them to be able to do more work. Because I think, because this is, yes, it's a macro level problem, but it's also deeply nuanced. And as the discussion about the lens yesterday, that is something that requires a deeply leveled of it will work because it's nuanced and it operates on the ground and it's human centric. And I just think there's something about unleashing that at the moment, because I feel like these organisations at the moment are suffocating because they don't have the freedom to move. Yeah. And this is an age in which we need to move, so we need to treat each other in a way that reflects that.
That was way more than 15 seconds.
I can't do 15 seconds.
Archie, 10 seconds to make up.
Sorry, Archie. Sorry.
No, I think that there's two things. One is there needs to be a holistic multi-capitals approach to all public valuation and public procurement, and they just need to get on with it. So, the transformative levels of funding for someone at my level is completely different to what you're dealing with. And you can deploy transformative capital now on an almost no regrets basis.
Thank you, Ruchir.
Well, I guess, the Cabinet Secretary of Finance's in Scotland's speech yesterday here was brilliant, and if she could implement all that, that would be excellent. And I guess there's been nuggets in some of the stuff that Rishi Sunak has been saying as well in terms of his approach in getting things moving on the cracking on agenda. So I guess if both of them were to kind of read out each other's speeches and make a commitment to do that, maybe we might see something.
That's great.
Brilliant. I'm going to just throw in my own there at the end. We need the pipeline funded. So it'd be great to see a NERF equivalent here in Scotland. That would be amazing. And we need those codes funded. We need those codes, so that would be just throwing it out there. So thank you so much to our wonderful panel. I wonder if we can join me in showing our appreciation. Thanks, Zebra. And thanks to all those listening online.